Hi team, Aces up here for PokerNerve with another video on the Donk bet. Although connected flops like 5, 6, 7 are the best for donk betting given how favourable they are for the big blind defender's range, let's look at some other flops where donk betting is also a great option. And we'll see the sorts of hands a GTO solver would bet and the frequencies as well as the bet size. And hopefully this analysis will provide you with some takeaways so you can become more proficient at donk betting. If so, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out on future videos. Okay, so identifying flops where donk betting could be a thing is about recognizing whether the in position or out of position player, remember that's mostly really the big blind when we refer to donk betting, it's about who has the nut advantage. So lower connected boards, low paired boards where the pair is around say 9 or lower are some of the better boards for the big blind player. And that's really the case here, isn't it, on this Ace 8-8 rainbow board where the out of position player can be defending with a lot of 8x. We can see here from the 6-8 off all the way up to the ace-8 suited and the ace-8 off. If we go across here all the way down to the 8-2 suited, looking at these 8x rows. So they have a lot of nutty holdings, a lot of pretty strong holdings with the ace-x. And so definitely, since this board will look a little bit dangerous to the in-position player, since we do have a lot of 8x, you can see here they don't have that much 8x. That will prompt them to check back more frequently and pot control even with a lot of their stronger holdings. And so that being the case, the out of position player is incentivized to build the pot themselves and do so with a bet on the flop, which is exactly what I'm going to do here with this combo that we have, which does have a backdoor flush and straight. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and bet here. I might actually go with the bigger size, and that is because we are representing a little bit more of a polarized range. So we're sort of saying here, leveraging the fact that we can have a lot of these nutty combos. And so I'm going to go with the bigger size. Our opponent does call, and we get the deuce of hearts on the turn. So since we haven't improved at all, perhaps a diamond, 8, 9, 10, sorry, not an 8, a 9 or 10, or a diamond, we could have fired again, or a selection of other cards, but certainly the deuce, the driest of driest cards, is going to be better for our opponent's range, since they do still have a lot of those stronger ace-x's and some nutty combinations, pocket aces, ace-8 quads. So I think I am just going to check now. Remember that you don't always have to just fire off. You're really looking for those cards on the turn and river that fit your range. And again, it's not really the case on the river. We could bet here, though, to fold out some pairs like 9s or 5s, for example, that might have called the flop. Maybe a few other weaker combos like a Jack-Queen suited or something like that. But if we start always bluffing the river once we donk the flop, we might become extremely unbalanced. And what I mean by that is that if we start betting the flop with, say, here, 6-7 of clubs or Jack-9 of spades and a few other combinations like that mixed into the time with the times that we do have an 8x or sometimes maybe with an ace, we could end up just by the river when we take a bet check line and then bet again, being very, very bluff heavy, since we will have a lot of those cards that sort of wrap around the 8 or have backdoor flushes on this rainbow board. So with this specific combo this time, I'm just going to check. And we can see our opponent does check back. They had the pocket 4s. So let's have a look at our play here. So we can see that in PO, it's going to be betting with this combo. It looks like around 43% of the time, and it will be favoring that larger, more polarized size on this board. Makes sense. Of course, it is still checking the majority of the time. The turn, you can see it's mostly checking. It will actually still bluff at a reasonably high frequency here on the turn. And again, when it does, it's actually choosing a very large size, going on the, what is that size actually? That's 115%. It's going over pot on the turn here, so going for that real polarized, I have an 8x type of bet on the turn, or obviously a bluff, and it will actually use this combo at a frequency, although we can see the best EV play is to generally just check. Opponent checks back, but the opponent could also sometimes bet as well, which I guess just protects for the times we have the sort of hands we have. It's a kind of protection / semi-bluff. And then on the river, you can see that we should just be giving up this combo, and it's basically a pure strategy of 100% check. And that's something I just spoke about, isn't it? That we do want to be a little bit careful that we don't start over bluffing in situations like this. If we just have a quick look in PO here, this combination, you can see that on this ace 8-8 flop, it's using a polarized size and donking just under 20% of the time. And you can see it's doing that with those sort of combos that I was talking about that sort of wrap around the 8 and have backdoor flushes, backdoor straights, 6-10, as well as, of course, the 8x here, 8x here. And it is mixing in a few of the ace-x combinations. It's important to note that it is sometimes using the smaller size as well at a reasonable frequency. And it is doing that especially with the ace-x's, which makes sense. Obviously, you don't want to go about betting huge when you have a hand like ace-6, because you're missing out on a lot of hands like, well, small pairs. You want to keep them in there. Some other hands that you're doing really well against, like say king-jack, which might peel. And you can see if we do bet that smaller size, hands like that are supposed to continue. They might pick up a pair on the turn now, and we can either check or get value on the river, or bet again for value, small again. So definitely want to, it makes sense to be betting a little bit smaller with those medium strength hands. But when we don't block the ace and we have an 8, we definitely want to bet bigger the majority of the time and try and really get max value and prevent our opponent from, as I mentioned, going for that check back, costing us a street of value. Okay, so let's move on and see another hand now. Okay, here's a good one. We've got the pocket sixes on the 3-4-5 rainbow board, one of those 5 low boards that are going to be donked at some frequency. Now, if we have a look at the range versus range interaction, we can see that we do have some of these sort of small combinations that are going to hit this board or be pushing pretty good equity with a combo draw, like a pair and a straight draw. Whereas if we compare that to our opponent's range, we can see that they don't have nearly as much of that stuff. And in fact, not much 5x for top pair, not that much 6x for the up and down, or 2x. They only have 10% of ace-2 off, which is worth noting, because we have 100% of that. Of course, they still have the sets and all the overpairs and that sort of stuff, but this is a board that we will have some strong holdings on, and our opponent might be a little bit wary and do a fair bit of checking back on, and that forces us to want to put some money into the pot with some of our hands. And I think pocket sixes is one such hand. We have pretty good equity anyway against some of our opponent's better holdings. The hand benefits from getting protection. And that being the case, I'm going to bet. Now, we did say we won't be donking as much on these sort of 5 low boards. It's mostly the 6 and 7 high boards and some 8 high boards that we're donking on frequently, and therefore using a smaller size. Now we are getting a little bit more polarized because we have to respect the fact that our highest overpair is only 7s, and that's only at 50% frequency, and our opponent can still have all the pairs and the sets, as well as a few straight combos like the 6-7 suited. So I'm going to go with a bigger size here. And we see a call here. Now, this is a really interesting turn, isn't it? I think we can mix between checking and betting. I don't even mind betting again here. I think in this particular instance, I'm going to go with a check. Our opponent does bet, so I'm just going to go ahead and call here. I don't think we want to turn our hand into a, set our hand up for a bluff. I think we've probably got pretty good equity against opponent's range anyway. Sometimes the best hand, and a good draw that will give us the best hand if we hit a 2-7 or a 6 as well is an interesting one. Now, if I was against a lower stakes player that I think is going to have trouble folding, I might just again bet the river here, just thinking that they're going to call off really light and with some hands that they shouldn't really be calling with, since we can have some 2 and 7x. and some other stronger holdings like 2 pairs that might occasionally value, but at a low frequency. But I know that GTO solvers normally treat this type of hand as a bluff catcher, and the reason is because we do have so many of those straight combinations, and I'm just going to play it that way as a bluff catcher and go ahead and check. Our opponent has gone for a double pot shove. I think this combination just has to call. Click the call button, and you can see our opponent did have the 7-9 of clubs, so they did river the straight. If we have a look at the way we played the hand, we can see we actually played it perfectly. From a GTO perspective, you can see that it will be checking the flop, of course, the majority of the time. As we know, this is a low frequency donk bet flop, but when we do donk, and here around a quarter of the time, which is kind of high, actually, a little bit higher than I thought, but definitely a good choice that we made to use that more polarized big size. It's using that the majority of the time, putting a lot of pressure on opponent's high card holdings, leveraging the fact that we do have some nutty combinations here, but not an overwhelming advantage, especially when we factor in all those overpairs that our opponent can have. So going for that big size turn, we went for a check, which is what GTO would do the majority of the time. But we could continue to bet, and I find this quite interesting that it chooses that sort of larger size there. That is on the turn a 3/4 pot size. So continuing to sort of put pressure. It's very mergy really, isn't it, on the turn? But sort of protection, but also putting pressure on some of opponents' hands that still have equity. And then by the river, after we got called, checking again. Just checking and calling is just a pure strategy, just bluff catching. And this particular occasion, of course, our opponent had 7-9 and was bluffing the turn and then got there. But overall, with this range against the range we're up against, we played the hand perfectly, so that's good. And you can see that although we are focusing, of course, on donking the flop, it's important also to follow it up and discuss sort of how the hand can eventuate on the later streets. Because that's obviously going to be a big part of having a good donk betting strategy. This hand here, we've got 7-9, and we've got one of those 6 low boards, but it's monotone. So how would you proceed here? Now remember, similar to C betting, we really benefit from betting small when we do decide to donk in this situation. And the reason is simply because opponents will usually have either hands like Jack Queen of spades that they're just going to fold, or hands that are fairly inelastic, like, for example, pocket queens with a heart or ace 10 with a heart that is just going to continue even if we bet large. So we really are incentivized to bet small here and generate a little bit of fold equity. We're also pushing a little bit of equity here with a double belly buster and a flush draw. On this particular turn, I think I am actually going to just bet small again. Now, remember, we do not want to be donking very often on these monotone boards, but I guess occasionally if we are going to, this is a pretty good flop to... Well, our specific hand is pretty good to do it with, and we do get lucky on the turn and make the best hand against ace queen of diamonds here. If we have a look at our play here, you can see that it's only betting on this monotone board, as we said, very rarely, and here it's just a couple of % of the time. And again, that is just due to the fact that our opponent will have a lot of the best flushes, including a lot of those nut flushes and a lot of those overpairs, and if they do contain a heart, a lot of the time they're going to have us in really bad shape. And so we need to be very careful on this board, especially against Cutoff, who also has quite a number of flushes. And remember, our biggest overpair is only 7s. So definitely tread carefully in this sort of situation, and very rarely use the donk bet unless it's for exploitative reasons. And this is getting into the territory of bad donk betting flops now, where the equity disadvantage is too great and there's little to no nut advantage to leverage. And commonly these sorts of flops are trips, monotone, high card, paired, disconnected two-tone, the high XX flops and the ace XX flops, and just in general, as we've seen, a large majority of flops. One exception to this is the ace low boards, such as ace 2-3, where a big blind player will often have 2 pairs, straights, and sets in their range, combinations of hands, which in position won't often have that many of. Let's take a look at this spot now in PO and see how it plays. And when I say PO, of course, I mean the simple GTO trainer, but of course, all these hands generated by PO. What would you do with some 4x and 5x? some two pairs, some pairs. Keep in mind that we have the ace-2 and ace-3s, and even a little bit of 2-3 suited, and a 4-5 suited and offsuit for the nuts. And we can, of course, do a little bit of betting here, but it's also important to remember that our opponent is going to be c-betting on this board a lot. So against cutoff, this is probably a situation where we don't want to be doing much donking at all. I'm just going to go ahead and check here. We'll open up PO shortly. Just going to go ahead and fold. We played the hand fine. If we have a look in PO, so you can see that our opponent did in fact just bet king queen. And so since they know that we've got a lot of trash, they're going to be c-betting here. You can see after we check at a really high frequency. So that being the case, we can just go ahead and use an aggressive check raising strategy. And in fact, almost 20% of the time we're check raising. And we're only donking around 8% of the time, you can see here. So not quite 10% of the time. And the combinations that we will use are, of course, some of our better ace-x, including two pairs here at a frequency, some 2x at a frequency and 3x at a frequency, of course, the gut shots for 4 and 5. That's for the most part the bulk of it. We can see a few percent of just sort of trashy bluffs that just end up with a great result when they force our opponent off their equity mixed in, but just balancing that with some of our stronger hands and draws. So again, quite a mix, but a very low percentage on this board. So use it sparingly and do, of course, adjust to how your opponent will respond. If you think that they will overfold, you can see that if we do opt to lead small here, they should be only folding 7.7% of the time. So if you think your opponent is going to start folding hands like Queen Jack, King Highs, or even a hand like say, Queen 7, I think a lot of opponents, even with a backdoor flush, might just fold to a bet on this flop, especially at the lower stakes. So you might be able to exploitively bluff a little bit more in this spot, but just be careful that you don't start getting too bluff heavy, or you've misread your opponent and all of a sudden they start floating wider than you thought, or raising, because they should be raising around 16% of the time here, but not too high, because they do have to respect those nutty combinations that we can have, of course, including the nuts, the straights. So another interesting hand, but I think that's enough about that one, because this spot isn't going to come up a ton, because remember, we're talking about although heads up pots when we're in the big blind are the most common in Hold'em, we are still only donking at a low frequency on this very specific board texture. And so it's not something that's going to come up a lot, but it's really important when it does come up that you're familiar with the sort of strategy that you want to use. And when you do want to donk, the right hands to do it with, or if you get donked into, and if your opponent is a good player, thinking about what a good donk betting strategy would look like and how you should be responding to it. Or perhaps they're just being efficient donking, and then you're going to act accordingly by either overfolding if you think the sort of player that just flops top pair and bets, which there are quite a number of those types out there, or if they're one of those types that are on the bluffier side and just say, hey, it's an ace high I'm going to try and represent, and they're over bluffing, you can float and bet on the turn, or just raise on the flop accordingly. So be patient with your donk bets. Don't be looking to donk bet at every opportunity. But as we've seen, there are some very good spots to utilize the donk bet where we can increase our EV. So that was a variety of flop textures where we discussed the merit of donk betting and saw the sort of ranges a solver would use, as well as the frequencies and bet sizes. We also touched on exploitative opportunities. All in all, quite a lot of important info condensed into this short tutorial. So if you want to learn more about donk betting, be sure to head over to PokerNerve. I hope you enjoyed this video and good luck on the felt. This was Aces Up for PokerNerve. See you next time.